decided to follow Jesus.
May the words that I speak be your words, and if they're not, may the sound that fall on the ears of those who listen become your words. Amen.
Amen.
Andy, I thought it was terrific you mentioning the first two verses of This Is My Song. The third verse was written by Georgia Harkness. And Georgia Harkness was one of the great pioneers in women's rights. She wasn't accepted into to become a minister. She was not allowed that path, but she got her doctorate in divinity, and she wrote the most marvelous book called Christian Ethics that I've used in my Sunday school classes. And it's not in print anymore. You can get it at Amazon though for 99 cents, and you ought to do that. It's the greatest book that's ever been written on Christian ethics. She also established some scholarships, and one of the people sitting among us was a recipient of one of those scholarships. She was our speaker last week, you may remember her. And Helen, you were a recipient and marvelous lady. And she was a Methodist minister. She became a Methodist minister. So I digressed enough. What are we here for? About a year ago, I began writing this book. It's entitled Free to Learn, Free to Teach. And this was about my concerns about the trauma, especially the abuse that's the use and misuse of achievement tests are fostering and imposing upon our public schools and our teachers and our kids. And I think abuse is the correct term, following up what Paul Duncan talked to us about a couple of weeks ago. I was going to entitle the book The Tyranny of Testing. Then I found out there was a marvelous book that had been written by that title by Dr. Barnish Hoffman. So I got a copy of his book, and I discovered his path was terrific, but I wasn't about to follow the same path he'd taken. And my mission is in a little different direction. But I was meandering around doing more reading and talking to people, and I got a suggestion from an honored educator and friend that I should read a book entitled The Courage to Teach. Thank you. It's written by Dr. Palmer, and I found the path I wanted to travel with this book. So my new title, Free to Learn, Free to Teach, is about how our schools, how our teachers, how our children can and must keep their integrity and their mission while being in the middle of the mess and chaos that I choose to call the testing standards-driven disaster. And this too will end. So let's see where we're going with those thoughts. Do you all have a copy of my philosophy of education? I hope you do. If you were unfortunate enough, heaven forbid, to be a member of one of my classes, perhaps in test and measurements, you'd arrive in my class and you'd find three little strange things. One is you'd be handed a copy of my philosophy of education. And the reason for that is the two reasons. One is I want you to know who I am and how you interact with me in the classroom. And the other one is I think you ought to write your own. The second thing you'd be interested in seeing is that there was no midterm or exam scheduled. Midterm or final exam scheduled. Okay? How about that? All of you have sweated your way and done all of that cramming and so forth. Because that's how I think people learn. It's not learned by memorizing stuff and so forth, it's by becoming active in the process. Learning by doing as John Dewey said. The third thing you would be interested in hearing, and I want you to hear this. If this were a course in tests and measurements, I would say at the very beginning, what we can measure is not worth measuring. And what is worth being measured is not measurable. And I want you to carry that thought all the way through the whole debacle of achievement testing. Standardized achievement testing. Standardized achievement testing. Because we all do achievement testing, we do that. And I will speak a little bit more about that a little later. But let's take a look at my philosophy of education, because it's what we really what I'm really here to talk about. And you'll notice that I have been influenced by some interesting people. One is Jesus of Nazareth, but there are two names you may not know. One is Johann Pestalozzi, and the other was Frederick Froebel. Pestalozzi was an educator in Switzerland, and Froebel was an educator in Germany, and they each established on their own what we now call the kindergarten, the garden of the children, kindergarten, okay? Which no longer exists, by the way. Oh, it exists in name, and you can find it there, but it is Maria Montessori and Froebel and Pestalozzi are spinning in their graves right now. Because we're preparing kids to go to college, and we're teaching them things in kindergarten. And I do have some, and I really want to pass on that. But what we're asking them to do in kindergarten is pre-college. So the garden of the child is not a concept anymore. Let's look at some other stuff here. My basic beliefs about teaching and learning are in the first one. The teacher is a caring guide and resource person who is involved in the student's growth as a learner and as a unique person. Now, if we say that a unique person, then it actually keeps out standardized testing. You can't do any standardized stuff with unique people. That's just simply how it is. And next line is that I'm interested in my children in the person growth, not where they're going, but their person growth, what's happening with them right now. The process of learning is more important than the product of learning. How you learn is more important than what you learn. There was a marvelous thing in the newspaper the other day about Indian education with David Wilson and so forth. I hope you saw that. Now, that's not in our history books. And it should be sometime, maybe years later, but it's not now. But if I were to teach that and say, have David come in and so on, I'd be having to give up some time getting my kids ready to take their achievement test. I can't do that. I can't even use what we used to call the teachable moment. I can't even use that anymore, because I don't know if that's going to be on the achievement test that I really need to have, and I'm really having to protect my kids, because I don't want them to flunk, and I want to talk a lot more about that, about what can happen, what has happened. Learning consists about both thinking and feeling. It's commonly called flinking, not uncommonly called flinking. Anyway, we always think about, well, let me digress, because I want to talk to you more about that later when I talk about incident I had teaching. Let me just hold that off a while. And each of these little kids has great potential, a marvelous bicameral brain. Wow! In addition, each of us is emotional, physical, aesthetic, social, physical, and spiritual being. That's what we are. We're just not brains that our stuff is poured into us and pour the stuff into them. This is sponge theory, one that I really like to present to my students. You can work with them in a sponge theory. You pour all the stuff in top of them, and then once in a while you have a test and you bring out the sponge. Okay? It's really a good visual. And then a little farther down, the learning environment is a safe place allowing for risking and creativity. And a little farther farther down, it says something about making mistakes is an integral part, an essential part of the learning process. If you're going to risk, you're going to make mistakes. That's part of the growth, part of your growth. And if you read at the very bottom, I mentioned Khalil Gibran at the top, and this is, if anything, this is my creed. And by the way, the entire thing is a creed, so, you know, I was supposed to be talking about the theology of learning or education, whatever. Here's a creed right here. I believe that if the teacher is indeed wise, he does not bid you enter the house of wisdom, but rather lead you to the threshold of your own mind. That's my belief, that's my creed. Okay. So I'm here now to tell you a little bit about my experience in testing. I have to get back to that. That was supposed to be the theme. So let me go and give you some personal experiences in the field. Back in 1938, oh my heavens, I was in 6th grade back then. I was in Washington School in LaSalle, Illinois, down on 3rd Street. And there were two older kids sitting in the back of the room, Cy and Alex. They were the sons of Italian immigrants, and they spoke only Italian at home. They were larger than we were. They didn't have anything to do with us, and we didn't have anything to do with them either. But one day, Cy got up and he said, "Miss Klein, I'll be 16 years old tomorrow." And she said, "Thank you, Cy. Good luck and goodbye." He'd been flunked 4 times. A few days later, Alex came up, same thing, flunked 4 times. In 1950, I began teaching in the Deer Park Rural School in Illinois, in the middle of the cornfields, literally now, cornfields all around northern Illinois, north central Illinois, and there I was in a nice white building with 19 kids from grades 1 through 8. It is by far the best teaching, learning situation we've ever had, perhaps not only in this country, but perhaps everywhere. And let's take a look at it. I had a very marvelous 4th grader by the name of John, spelled Jon, but I thought John. And he was smart as could be. And so once in a while I'd invite him to come over and sit in with the 5th and 6th graders, and and even sometimes with the 7th graders. I had in the 7th grade a young lady by the name of Rita, who was just as bright as John. And Rita and her sister Gail, who was in 8th grade, were my teacher aides, was my 5 first graders. And we had this whole flow in the community, this whole flow of us learning together. And we met her one time, Bobby, you remember, at a restaurant many years later, and she said, "Mr. Pierro?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "I'm Rita Myrtle." And I said, "Okay, yeah." And she said, "I remember." And I said, "Oh, okay." And she said, "You know what I remember the most? You came and played outside with us." That's what you remember most, okay? That was this experience, we learn by our experiences, and this was marvelous. No retention, because the concept had no meaning there. I mean, the whole idea flowed from one to another, and one test and one test only, and that was that my 8th grader Gail had to pass a test to get into the LaSalle County board test, and in terms of entrance into LaSalle Township High School, one test only. A few years later, I was teaching in DPPJuly, Illinois. I was teaching 6th grade, and we were all doing the metropolitan test, achievement testing. And our superintendent decided that if any student fell behind 2 years in a row on the achievement test, he or she would be retained. Okay? And the other teachers and I got, absolutely angry to the nth degree. Because we had spent 9 months with these kids, interacting with them and so on, and we thought we knew more about whether they should be retained in 6th grade than that stupid, that metropolitan achievement test. The year I left there, 2 of my students were retained. Both of them were children of Mexican immigrants who were brought up to work in the zinc foundry in that town and lived in the country homes. Okay? Company homes. And they spoke more Spanish than anything else. Okay? They were retained. A few years ago, a few years after I moved up to Barrington, Illinois, and started teaching 4th grade there, had a 4th grade reading up, and we began into a thing that had evolved into what we now call the golden age of education. And the basic thing that we were doing was individualized reading in the 4th grade, which meant that of my 29 students, 3 times a week, I met with them one-on-one as they were reading. Because each of them learned reading differently, and it wasn't possible to teach them all how to read whatever at the same time. And we call that child-centered education. The other education previous to that was called subject-centered education. You were given a subject and you learned that. And do you have number 1 up there? Good. Number 1. We can see it over. Leave all 3 of them up there. Can you see that over there on the side well enough?
Sorry.
Okay. That one over there. Yeah. See, when we gave a test, what we did is we wanted our children to come out with no F's, hopefully. Maybe a D or so, 1 or so. Mainly a lot of C's, a few B's, and just a few A's. That's the curve that we were using. Okay? And it's based on what is called the perfection system, 94 to 100 a day, and all those things. I'm not telling anything you don't know. But this is what we were working with. We wanted some students to be superior, and we were unhappy about others, but we worked with them. Okay? Keep that curve in mind because you saw the other 2, and we'll talk about them later. In 1959, I moved up to Plainfield, and I was working on my doctorate at Northern Illinois University, and I took a job as assistant superintendent in curriculum and testing, a K through 12 school district. And I want to just describe the process that we use there, and maybe you can compare it to some of the things you've seen or heard lately about how tests are being given. Okay? As part of the National Defense Education Act, we were, President Eisenhower, which was passed because we were concerned. Sputnik went up in the air, before some of you may be historically aware of. And Sputnik went up in the air, the Russians beat us to space, and President Eisenhower thought we should improve our science and math programs. And so he was giving all of us free tests, and the tests were to be used to evaluate our entire curriculum system and see if math and science were being done okay in our system. All right? And we were specifically told we were not to use them to evaluate a school, a teacher, or a child. we were not to evaluate them to evaluate a school, a teacher, or a child. That was part of the process in our workshops when we were working with that. What I did, and this was common at the time, is I gave the test to let's say, my third grade teacher, and she, and it was she, I can remember, was told, and we did this in meetings, so that give the math test battery, part of the battery, during your regular math time that would ordinarily be teaching math in your classroom with the same kind of attitude and everything that was happening at the same time. By the way, this is called state-dependent memory because, and it's in a book by Catherine Myers entitled Memory Loss in the Brain, and she found that subjects who learn information in one room are able to remember more when tested in the same room than in a different room. And so let's extrapolate it. It's even better if the same teacher is there and not a stranger. And it's better if they're not being given their directions over a loudspeaker. Okay, that's called state-dependent memory. Remember that. So, a teacher would give the test there. They actually were given the testing thing to actually score the test themselves, so they had some information about how the kids did on that before we sent them to Ames, Iowa for the computer to take over. Okay. The next incident I want to talk to you about, personal incident, was up in Glen Ellen, Illinois. Glen Ellen is, our son lives there now. It's a rich, that's the best word, okay. It's a rich western suburb of Chicago. And I got there and I was in the junior high at that time. And there was a disaster, an absolute disaster, because the achievement scores came in to our junior high and our high school, Glenbard High School, and all of the scores were down from the year before, really down. The previous years, several years, they were that. That's what they were. Okay? All right. Are you ready? When they got to the computer people weren't happy with that because it had destroyed their normal curve. Okay? So what did they do? They scored everything back, and if the child got 28 out of 30 or something like that, it was now, you would, let's say it the other way, had scored 24 and had gotten there, they demanded that next year they get 26. Correct, to get the same score. So they reconstructed and they do that periodically. In fact, they can do it every year now with the computers they have. So we had, during all this time, we were existing what we call the golden age of American education, and it was based on the growth of children. So we're going to start talking about the measurement now is not my work compared to this textbook, it's my work compared to what I'm able to do. How I'm doing as compared to my potential. It's called child-centered education, and it lasted in many ways in different places from 1960s to the late 1980s. And if you want to get a good look at it, pull up Finland, the Finland schools, and take a look at what's happening in Finland right now. Because all of the research we did back at that time is being used in Finland now. And Finland is the number one country in the world on the international testing. So here's some of the research that we did and that they're using. First, one of the things we worked on was trying to match up in our curriculum the age of maturation of children to what is being taught them, to what they're supposed to be learning, okay? Because if you start teaching people to do things such as reading and math before their maturation is not up with it, they can't do it. They simply cannot perceptualize it or conceptualize it. They can't do that. See? Just can't do it. So what happens is the child says, I must be dumb. Can't do this, and the whole place falls apart. You're seeing it in operation right now. So let me give you one example. Jean Piaget was the outstanding person in the field of maturation and readiness. And he showed, we had a movie, and there was a child sitting here, okay? And there's that child sitting here, and I'm the evaluator, I'm doing the research, okay? And the child is sitting on a blanket, and I have a piece of candy here in a crinkly covering on it, and I crinkle it and hand it to the child. Child laughs and hands it back. Okay? I take it and I show it to the child again, and I put it under the blanket in where the child can reach it, and has seen me doing it. And the child begins crying because the candy or whatever has disappeared. All right. So you pick it back up. Okay? Now, the question John Piaget asked is, what is the specific time that child matures to the place where she or he can reach under the blanket and say, aha, I got it. See? And that's exactly the same time as one child may be able to see the difference between the letter B and the letter D. As we all have taught young children, that's one of the things that you have to look at in terms of their growth. Or when is the time when the child understands that when you borrow a 10, you can change it in 10 ones and put it over here and add. And we were talking to a 4th grade teacher the other day, and they're asking children in 3rd grade to divide. Because you see, there's a problem here because you add over here, you subtract over here, you multiply over here, and you divide over here. Altogether different thing. And sometimes you're asking children to do things that has nothing to do with their mentality, it has to do with their maturation and their readiness to learn that. Okay, there's another study I think you would find fascinating, especially with the writing test they're doing in 5th and 8th grade now. They copied off a theme that was written by a high school student, and they just made copies, sent it out to thousands of teachers, and they came back being graded from A through F, same test, same thing. That's very simple. I mean, some are looking for, hey, there's no creativity here they don't know how to capitalize, so forth, They didn't really answer the topic that they started with, whatever. So all of these people being very subjective in their evaluation, and you had the other one. Yeah, the other one more. That one. That's how they were being scored. Okay. Well, the research went on with kindergarten, half day, Garden of the Child, Pestalozzi, Faribault, Maria Montessori saying and telling us play is the serious work of children, so forth, and no longer exists. Social promotion was a really great thing because we moved our kids out and we said, the research was very clear on that. Some of the bigger cities did this, they replicated it all over the place. They would take a number of students that they were going to retain. They split it in half with matched pairs. They retained one group and they promoted the other group. And what they found is the kids who were promoted did quite well. The kids who were retained actually did less well the following year than they had the year before. And by the way, if you want a target for bullying, have a retained kid, because he's in problem with the group he's in. He's in the new group he's in, and also from the group that would tease him about not being with them anymore. Okay, it's real target. All right, then we had Drake University came up with a thing called parent-teacher conferences, and I was in 4th grade teaching at the time. And, you know, instead of having A's and B's and so forth that have almost no meaning, okay, we were able to sit down with parents and say, this is what it is, and this is where we go, and so on, you know. And sometimes some of our schools were using parent-teacher-child conferences. And then we recognized that there were learning disabilities, and we recognized that there were learning modalities, that some people learn visually, and other people learn auditorially, and other people learn kinesthetically, and other people need tactile experiences, and so on. I am almost entirely a visual learner. Bobby is almost entirely an auditory learner. We don't learn the same way. We don't learn the same way at all, not. Okay? And then it also, we were using some teaching of creativity, a lot more art, a lot more music, a lot more literature, a lot more poetry. And if you haven't been reading something lately, we're seeing some of the arts being replaced with more time spent getting the kids ready to take tests. It's a disaster. Kids became active in their learning. When I was in 6th grade, I talked about, we sat there quietly, didn't work for anything. Now we want our kids up and down. In my 4th grade class, I had them all over the place, libraries and so forth. Each of them had projects to do, helping each other and so on. Anyway. Also, we did some good things in the high school. We started a comprehensive high school, and we started adding courses in shop and cooking and secretarial work and so forth, because we knew that there were some of our kids who were coming up there were just not able to be prepared to go to college and so on. And we had two great movements in education in our time. One is what we call a career tech or whatever it is, and the other is a junior college. And we're taking care of people who were not being taken care of earlier. Two great, absolutely great movements. Well, it had to end. 1965, President Johnson started a war on poverty, and it explicitly forbade the establishment of a national curriculum. There will be no national curriculum. You're all using the tests and so forth to evaluate and work with your own curriculum. Right? And then in 1983, we're ready for the next one. This appeared, and that appeared, both. Leave that one up. That's good. It's called The Nation at Risk. President Reagan, Secretary of Education Terrell Bell. And they decided for some reason or other that the score that they were looking at was leading us to, they almost said it's like we're losing a war, a military war. I wish I'd kept some of these sayings that came behind it, but it was, we've got to do something. There's something terribly wrong here. Well, the thing is, there was nothing terribly wrong, because later the Sandy National Laboratories decided that there was nothing wrong with the score that come through. But they were interpreted in such a way that it was a national disaster, our nation is at risk and we have a problem. And so it went on, and we came on to what is now the use of the standardized testing to determine taking the place of the classroom teacher. You know, one of the things that was pretty clear happened to us, me personally, back in 6th grade, but when you tell people that their children are going to be passed or failed, according to this one-day test or whatever they're doing, you're taking it entirely out of the hands of the teachers and the parents who've been working with this child, and you have just cut right through with achievement test scoring. Okay, that's the value on that. If you are dealing with voice, some of you, voice, they have a program, a PowerPoint program they showing what the whole business about what is called high-stakes testing. The reason it's high-stake testing is the amount of money that's involved. We're talking about billions of dollars throughout the United States. You know that we had a $14 million fiasco with McGraw-Hill Publishing Company. And, you know, I'm not sure I want to go there. That's all. Okay. But, you know, is it ignorance or is it malicious? Are we really, is there somebody out there trying to kill the American public school system? That's a good question. By the way, that's one of your assignments. Is there somebody out there? For one thing, we know that laughter in the halls is not there anymore. Children are not laughing the way they used to. Teachers are having stomach aches and everything else because they really care about what's happening to their kids. So it's a problem. Now, I don't know whether it's being done through ignorance, and there's a lot of ignorance out there. Once in a while I call the State Department and I say, what's the standard error of measurement on the RSA test? And they say, well, give me a while, we'll find out. And again, well, we really don't know. Now, let me just indicate something. When I gave my test to my junior high kids, we'll say on adding mixed fractions, I taught them the material on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and I tested them on Friday, and I tested them only on the material that they had learned in the first 4 days. This is called validity. It's called curricular validity. Because the material they were being tested on was in perfect correlation with what they'd been taught. Now you can contrast that to kids sitting down, taking this test, and have they prepared the test? Well, the teachers really don't know what's going to be on that test. Right? They really don't know. So, are the items on the test what they have learned up to that time in order to take the test? And I would say probably not. It's not very good correlation. But there are some other models out there that make sense. Can we get the picture of the children? You know, the other a couple of weeks ago we had the art camp here. And I visited for one evening and watched what's going on. And how many of you? Hands. Yeah. Okay. We're involved. We helped clean up, by the way. But Marla was here, standing right about here, I think, or so, and she thanked all the teachers and helpers that were involved, but she forgot to make any, to thank the people who gave the grades and who sent the report cards home to their parents. And the reason is that we didn't do that. I mean, these kids actually learn without being tested. Woo! Golly! And you know, we sit in Sunday, we sit down in the room down here and we have someone leading us, and he doesn't send us report cards. In fact, he would, I taught Sunday school for about 25 years, and I would really never grade my students, because I really don't know who's greatest in spirituality, for one thing. So we don't do that, see? So there are some things being learned without being tested, even though there was a statement by our soon-to-be forgotten Secretary of Education in the state that if it isn't tested, it has no meaning. Quote, okay? There are things being done here. I imagine something's happening with coexist, and people learning, and we're not sending them report cards, okay? There were no reports of stomach aches or nightmares, were there, as a result of our camp? You hear any of those? No? None? Any parents call up and say their kids were having health problems? No? Didn't happen? Can't be. They must have learned anything. Oh, that's it, yeah. But the State Department said that learning doesn't happen unless it's been tested. Okay? Now, I always finish the session. That's good for you. Got that? I'm almost done. Thank you. That's a good signal. I always finish the session by requiring that the participants have more questions than answers. When you get done here, you're supposed to have more questions than answers. And you're supposed to go out and read up a little bit more about Georgia Harkness and who she was and what she did. For one thing, that's one thing. And by the way, you ought to read up a little bit about Sean. Compose quickly. Sibelius. And while in writing it in 1939, when there was a war between Finland and Russia, that was part of what was happening there. So Finlandia was part of our history, so you ought to look that up. I mean, it's good, so I'm leaving with you. And another thing you ought to do is talk to our teachers, talk to our administrators, find out what's happening, and become active. I have applied to be on this new set of things that they're going to make some new standards up, and I'll see what happens there. Okay. But I do want to give you to close with one answer. Okay? And the answer can be found in Matthew chapter 19, verses 13 to 15. And it says, "Then children were brought to Jesus that he might lay his hand on them and pray. The disciples rebuked the people, but Jesus said, 'Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for to such belongs the kingdom of heaven.' And he laid his hand on them, and he went away." Amen.
Amen. I have decided to follow Jesus.